I think if you don't have a team that's looking at things horizontally, you really start to run the risk of just really making a broken experience or duplication of roadmaps. You even have that even if you are centralized to some extent. But I think when you have that, it can help just make sure that there is more cohesion that happens as you scale.
Hi everyone, welcome to Design Drives, where we explore why, how and what design and designers are driving forward. The mission is to interview the most forward-thinking designers and most innovative creators on the planet, to inspire and help you to reach your full creative potential and to make a positive impact in the world. In the episode, I chat with Kate Nygaard, who is a design director at WhatsApp, has been previously working at Airbnb, Spotify and Method as a design director. With Kate, we discuss how to manage teams and foster creativity and innovation in design projects. We also discuss what she learned working with some of the best product teams in the world and what fuels outstanding successful products, and what she has learned when she is working at Airbnb during COVID, and how design actually helped to create and explore new possibilities during a time of uncertainty and change. I hope you enjoy the episode. So I'm here with Kate Nygaard. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Sure, thank you for inviting me.
So really looking forward to the episode. We're going to talk about design leadership, managing teams, building out design cultures, and then also learning from you when it comes to working with some of the best product teams out there. You have been working at a lot of different companies like Airbnb, Spotify, and WhatsApp, for example. So we're really looking forward to that. I think what would be really great for the audience, if you could just maybe talk a little bit how it all started out for you. How did you got into design? And a little bit about your journey.
Sure. So I think I kind of got into design very organically. It was not something I really even knew it was a thing that I could be doing. I studied music, anthropology, and art history, which weirdly kind of, I don't know, none of those things could make me money, obviously, I thought anyway. But I kind of felt like, in a strange way, those type of interdisciplinary things kind of came together into the space of experience design for me. So when I first started out, I was in San Francisco and interning at an agency there. And I was more as a producer, so I didn't really know much of anything. It was just, designing websites and things like that. But you basically did everything. So it was a small design shop. And I think that was the first time I started to think about how this was the closest thing I could imagine from what I studied to kind of map to the things that I did the most. So what I thought was really cool is that there's engineers, and it kind of satisfied this geeky tech side like complex systems that I thought were really interesting that I didn't know anything about, but it was just me learning. And then design, which I never thought I would be good at, but I just thought of art is this place to get into, but not necessarily design and graphic design. The other piece of it was just around production of producing and project managing, which that's where I started, but it wasn't really my strength. But it just, those types of things came together for me and it really clicked. And so I think starting out there, I just never left. I started at a really young age and just continued to hone in on design as the central piece of what I wanted to focus on. And I think it wasn't until that first job that I started to realize how much I loved design. I think growing up, I thought marine biology was really cool, and I was always into fashion and always into music. So there's just something emotive about those types of things in that space that drew me into working at a design shop and organically kind of falling into design.
Yeah, I mean, that artistic side that you are mentioning, right? Like, music and fashion, I think there's an interlinkage, I think, when it comes to the creative side. And then, after starting out, I mean, you've been working at, you as you said, you started very young, and then you worked at, all of these different companies. How did that all come together for you?
Again, it was really randomly organic. I just followed my gut the entire time. There was no plan. This is maybe exposing a lot of my kind of ill-planned way that I dealt with my future. But I was excited. It was like a playground of different technologies and new things to learn. And I felt like I had a richer experience when I left university versus when I was in university in a weird way. And I ended up coming to London and working for an agency in London for a while, and kind of going back and forth between San Francisco and London. And I think just fell into places like Yahoo, for example, where I started out as this person that was interested in art and music and fashion. And it's just kind of interesting that thread kind of carried through where I ended up working, whether that was at Spotify or at Netters Reporter or even at Airbnb, where it's travel, which is a big thing, of just kind of part of who I am as a person. I think I'm quite different from a lot of the people you'd see in Silicon Valley from that standpoint. Even at Facebook, within WhatsApp, I'm much more of an artist when I approach design and when I approach even design direction or anything operational. And it's a slightly different tact from a lot of the people that you see in the industry that we're in. But yeah, I think from when I first started out, I think those types of disciplines in that area really kind of drove the people's passions, and my passion for those spaces really drove my interest in diving deeper into the world of tech and design. So I always was drawn to places that had more of that intersection, whether that was fashion and tech coming together, if that was music and tech coming together, or travel and tech coming together. I just discovered through my experiences where my strengths were. And I think by nature, I just, maybe because of more of a conceptual artist mind, I'd like to connect dots. And so there's this system thinking mind that I just naturally have. And there's, from cultural anthropology and just understanding people, you want to try to create these narratives that connect someone's story to the interface, or create the narrative arc for the interface, or what is the overarching journey that you want to have someone have as they go through an experience. So for me, it's just thinking about systems from a network journey all the way down to micro interaction, systematic thinking, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And then if you look back, when was the first time where you really noticed that you, with your role coming from a design side and all your experience, you can really make a positive contribution either to solving a problem for the user, solving a business problem, or just, making a positive impact? Was there any particular project that really, you can remember where you really had the feeling that you can, have a positive effect through your work?
It's a really good question, because I can't really think a particular project. I think there are certain times. I think Method was a place for me, Method Design Studios, where we were based in London, San Francisco, and New York, which is perfect for me. So I would go between those offices quite a bit. And the practice and mindset of thinking about service, product, and brand was very much a natural approach to the design thinking kind of way to solve problems. And I think that's where I just started to it just felt like the most natural aha moment for me, is being there and solving problems for places like Samsung and developing and creating design solutions for devices that help people with accessibility issues. So for me, I think empathy, even before then, was always core to how I think about things and self-design problems and understand the impact the design can have. But I think, weirdly, the parallels between that project and my personal life was just kind of this crazy thing, because I didn't see my job as just a job. I see it as, something very meaningful. And that's always been something that I find important about design and what it can bring. But I think that was probably the time that all these things kind of really came together for me, because I think until then I was trying to learn and figure out. I went to advertising agencies. I've been even in marketing to some extent, and then deep in systems in, Silicon Valley, and working on utilities for mail, for example. But I felt like that was the first time I could bring everything together and bring brand, product, and the service thinking even into the right connected place. And that to me started to define really what I find impactful and interesting about design.
Got it. I mean, you already mentioned accessibility. Was accessibility something that was important to you before, or was that really something that, has really changed you also as a designer, where you try to put more emphasis on it and try to include it into the projects? What are the challenges you're facing doing so?
I think it's maybe broader than just accessibility. I think it's improving people's lives. I think for the same reason you talked about doing your podcast around, how we can use design to make positive impact. That is very much what drives me in any place I go to, whether that's, and in some cases, like fashion, for example, isn't really making people's lives better, but it's satisfying like a passion of people's. And so I think there's just something really emotive about designing things that can create a positive emotional reaction. And those things I find really inspiring and exciting. I just could never get bored of it. So I think, whether it's improving or making someone's life easier in a home that someone's hosting when you go travel somewhere and that it's going to be accessible, to, making something super easy to play in Spotify or find the right kind of music or discover in different ways. And any one of those things can be really impactful. I think one of the most genius things that has a lot of impact in terms of what it says about a brand or the thoughtfulness of a brand is the quivering icon that happens, that state in iOS when you long press on your launch icons. I think there's something super impactful even about that, because I always remember it. At least it is for me. And I just think it's such a smart micro interaction. Those type of things are thoughtful. And I think those also drive impact.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, super interesting. Maybe let's dive into some of the experiences that you made and maybe some learnings working at these different companies. We're all in the times of transformation and change, and you've been working at Airbnb, I think, just before you moved to London to work at WhatsApp. And at Airbnb, obviously, you work just in the times where there was most transformation with COVID, and everyone's life changed. And I think what's interesting about Airbnb is that you also have to design for multiple users, but besides that fact and design that relationship, also the whole business model has changed right now. Basically, they're putting more focus on experiences and even online experiences. So what did you learn when you were designing at Airbnb when it comes to the change a company can go through and what that means for design?
It was a super tough time because it was, we also lost people, and I was part of that as well, which was terrible. I think even before that, I kind of knew it was coming because I oversaw the hosting side, and then there was someone else overseeing the guest side. And, in constant meetings, seeing the numbers dropping and dropping and dropping, and projections starting to look really concerning just in terms of the COVID-19 and what we thought might happen. And I think the thing that became so intense, but also I think brought a lot of us really close together was it's basically a time of crisis where everyone kind of who was there really wanted to help change and commit to trying to save the business, trying to do meaningful work that can support people who are frontline workers, for example. So a lot of the efforts pivoted from, moving from incrementality of trying to get conversion to how do we support frontline workers so they have free places to stay or low price places to stay in Italy or in different regions. And I think there's a certain level of pride of the design team and others that just wanted to make a difference and continue to kind of keep the experience high, but commit to, supporting what was happening. And I think concurrently as that was going on, you saw this wave of people or regions not really realizing how severe COVID was. And you'd see hosts get angry because we were having to change certain things. And then that sentiment would change again and become more positive. It's like this ripple effect that you saw over time. That was happening concurrently, which was crazy to see. So there was a lot of closer connection and communication with the host at that time. So I think it started to bring more light to the host and more attention to the host, which, to be honest, they needed. And I think there was a closer relationship there that happened just out of need, really. And then there's also the team too, and just wanting to support the team and trying to figure out how do you not let people burn out. We started to lose sense of hours and time, and everything was a priority and everything had to move quickly. So you're also trying to make sure that people don't burn out, that you have the right tenacity to push back if we needed to. It's tough to balance out urgency of a business that might be in crisis with everyone's well-being and knowing this is a very stressful time. So it was a really crazy time. And then from a design perspective, the pivots and changes that were taking place, we put into kind of a immediate action, like a task force that also tried to mitigate bifurcation of the experience. So looking at how do we create more transparency of all the changes happening. So making basically giant Figma files to share across all the teams to make sure that every time there's a change, everyone sees it and create that visibility. So as we were shipping things really quickly out to just help people who are frontline workers and, reacting to sentiment as COVID started to get worse and shift. But yeah, it was a really intense time. And I think everything was just accelerated in terms of what you learned from that experience. These pivots and these changes, I can do it more instinctually now and know what will work and what won't work in terms of shifting or pivoting. I see that maybe as an advantage, for other teams and scaling teams or changes or pivots. And then just being more cognizant of how people feel in a time that's so challenging. So yeah, it was like a lot of high running emotions and anxieties on top of a ton of change and stress that was going on at that time. So it was a big challenge.
So it really made you to emphasize more, especially you said with the host, right? The host user, because you have to design for the guest user and the host user, which is kind of interesting. And you really had to, get an understanding. What is the person feeling? What are their emotions? How could you use, with empathy, really understanding, like, how can you support them with an interface element, etc. And I can imagine that maybe some of the ideas you come across doing that exercise, you maybe think, the longer I think about it, this could have been useful even before, COVID or something like that, right?
Exactly. A lot of things that happened over the course of that time forced us to have more rigor around the system that we created. It forced us to simplify in some ways a lot of complexity that we sort of developed over time. Because you just, when you're forced to just hone in and focus, I think it really shifts your prioritization of things. You're really forced into making some tough decisions, whereas before a lot was prioritized. In this case, we had to really start to push on reducing things and pushing back. And then there were new things that spawned up that we would have never imagined, which is just around thinking about quality of stays, but then quality also meant high level of hygiene and safety and cleanliness. And so different protocols and things getting developed for that as well, and making sure that people were actually safe and did feel comfortable coming into people's homes. And that equally hosts felt like they had the right information to support all the things that they could do and even access, because a lot of people couldn't even access, antibacterial wipes for the longest time. So it was all these different things that we really had to concurrently try to nail down. But to say it was a pretty impressive effort done by everyone. Such a crazy turnaround by the end of the year of having such a positive IPO. Yeah, it was just a whirlwind of ups and downs in that time.
Yeah, the IPO was also in the middle of that. Totally right. And I mean, to your point before, I can totally see what you mean with, using empathy and coming up with new ideas. One thing that I'm always saying is that even accessibility, but, empathy in general is a tool also for innovation, right? You can really use it to come up with new ideas. It's not just about just making things incrementally better. And I guess you came up with, found sources for ideas and inspiration, basically, to come up with features and innovation that, could not just be benefit to a person being exactly that specific niche use case, but actually benefiting to all. I mean, one of the challenges must be also that you have to deal with all the different local regulations. When you design an experience for a person in India, that might be different, and depending on what information you show them in terms of like regulations and things they have to keep in mind, they might be completely different to a person in the UK towards like one in Brazil, right? So I guess that was also a challenge, I guess, from a content perspective almost, right?
Yeah, that's always, and policies, are widely different. I mean, that's pretty much in every product I've worked on, but I think, Airbnb was definitely, that's always a challenge, whether it's policy based or it's perception based of, what it's doing from a potential gentrification aspect, or what it's doing to local communities. Is it positive? Is it negative? How do we balance that out? I think there's a lot of consideration to trying to be cognizant of that as well. But obviously every country, like Germany, for example, I think not the most popular product in Berlin, for example. So I think it's just, that is a constant, and there's a whole team that focuses on policy, and they're global. And that's a massive, massive effort to try to ensure that we're getting to all the local regulatory mandates and things that shift and change. And policymakers work with the lobbyists all the time to try to make sure that we're moving upstream to manage and mitigate a lot of the regulations that Airbnb would run up against.
One interesting aspect is that also the whole focus of the product has to change, right? There were no physical states, and I think there was more an emphasis on experiences and then digital experiences even, right? The digital video experiences, video events, basically online events, which is a completely different space. And now suddenly you compete with, complete other platforms, like Eventbrite, for example, which, also went into that space. So I think that's very interesting. Any learnings how the design team was maybe able to imagine these futures or help in, carrying them out, or how did that process go?
So I wasn't actually in charge of experiences, but that team in particular was quite small, but they would just double down and focused on the digital experiences side once things all sort of went dark for Airbnb stays. That was the big focus. And so I think what was super impressive about Airbnb in that time is just how we quickly pivoted into just doubling down on the spaces that we needed to for the crisis that we were in, because we were definitely in one. We just did what we needed to. It was, to some extent, that's just kind of the nature of how Airbnb works. I think there's a lot of good gut instinct that's there as well in terms of what made the most sense. And a lot of the experiences that were digital actually were formerly physical. There are some of my favorites. I don't know if you've ever gone to there's the drag queen cocktail making class in Lisbon. It's just, that's my favorite, one of my favorite ones, but that one is amazing to do digitally, but it's just really cool to see. And some of the experiences, it's cool how that just happened kind of organically to some extent. And now it has become such an exciting new part of the platform. But yeah, unfortunately, I wasn't really part of that piece, but there's always opportunities to figure out how even hosts converge with experiences and that sort of thing too. So I'm excited to see what happens in that space moving forward. And I think a lot of was it Cameo even? I think some of those things, I don't know if they were inspired by experiences digitally, but I think that there are definitely some other startups after that popped up that seemed inspired by Airbnb experiences as well that were digital.
I can imagine working in such a change in terms of change. I think one of the great powers of design is, visualization, as basic as it sounds. But if you package it into a narrative, it can help to speculate about the future. It can help to make people imagine, and it doesn't have to be always correct. I mean, you have to not be correct with every vision you create, but at least shows people certain North Stars in terms of like how a product or company could go. And then it creates a platform for people to have a discussion about the future. And basically just shows a bandwidth of, different options of, where business could go. So I think that's very interesting. Now at WhatsApp, you design for billion users, you probably design for almost as many users at Airbnb, but I assume like there are more WhatsApp users than Airbnb users.
There's a lot more. It's a much broader reach, not so much in the US, but pretty much everywhere else outside of China. Yeah, it's quite a few people.
Yeah, quite a few people. And obviously at Airbnb, you designed for a lot of users, right? But I think the use case of WhatsApp is even more such a daily one, right? Main human need when it comes to communication. WhatsApp has been one of the most popular platforms for doing that. So I assume that's also in that regard different than designing for Airbnb, where you have a specific use case. You can design around a certain use case. And you can make certain decisions. While I assume at WhatsApp, you have to be sometimes more usability driven, or you really have to ask yourself, okay, this feature has to work for 2.x billion users. So, what it's like to design for basically, more than a billion users.
Yeah, it's super interesting to go through. I mean, it's not only because the Airbnb is, you're thinking about so many layers of the experience. Like you're thinking about the interface is the tiniest part. There's, it's the person's stay, it's the guest coming in, it's their journey trying to unlock and figure out how to get to the key box and get the code and unlock everything into the space itself. It's all those different layers. And with WhatsApp and messaging, it's super, super focused. And I think, and it's really system-based, it's a utility. But what I think is super interesting about WhatsApp, and I think maybe I'm more in awe of this as an American because less people use it in the US. So I don't have this emotional connection with WhatsApp like a lot of other people do outside of the US, although I'm starting to pick this up just because of people's energy around it. So when I say that I work at WhatsApp, I've had people thank me, which is pretty interesting. Like, thank me because I've helped them with their business somehow, or they get all warm and squishy about how it reminds them of their friends. And it's just super interesting that it evokes this emotion, even though it's just this utility, or this is how I see it. And I think the difference is not that, like in an Airbnb, was very similar to all the way down to design detail of every little tiny pixel is important from design perspective, which is why I think it wasn't a massive leap for me to go into WhatsApp. However, I think the big leap is, I think from an experience standpoint, this multi-layered aspect of thinking about design that I just carry with me, I think we're starting to need to have at WhatsApp. And so I think it's an interesting thing from a WhatsApp perspective. A lot of it is instinctual and really very passionately thinking about the user first, which is great. And it's all about simplicity and privacy and security and a highly, highly principled approach. And I think that's why it's done so well to scale to so many people. There's a very pure mindedness about the approach to WhatsApp and the thinking around the design. And it's all very detailed. I would almost equate it to a watchmaker thinking about the tiniest nuances of the design. And a lot of the attention is there. However, there's other spaces that we operate in to make sure the platform is safe, obviously. And that's where the other layers come in, like in the integrity team and making sure that we're mindful of bad actors on the platform and how do we manage that. So I think, and privacy and how do we ensure that. So I think there's a lot of thinking about that as well. So it's not just about the interface again itself, but all these other layers of experience that make it safe and secure and something that people have these emotional reactions to WhatsApp because of that. So it's different in the sense that it's, I think, a little bit more startup-y than Airbnb to some extent. And there's more focus on the interface itself, and the decision making for, like you said, releasing something to so many users is very, 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 very careful. And so there's a lot of consideration, a lot of deliberation and thoughtfulness that goes into designing the interface for WhatsApp.
And when you operate design at that level, how do you balance the aspect of basically something that is familiar something that people know, the usability, the carefulness. And on the other side, an aspect like innovation, new ideas, trends. Like how do you balance these two sides?
This is something that we're starting to explore a little bit more. We have a team in London that we're starting to look into. Integrate into other platforms, and so part of that is starting to look similarly to how Spotify. I don't know if they're still structured this way, but kind of like a flywheel of sorts, where you look at incubation and experimentation of different platforms, and then a team that starts to integrate based on bets that we think seem viable for us to take into integration. So, and we're starting to work on what it could look like to vision things out a little bit more. And I think there's a lot to learn yet in terms of being okay with the balance. Things like the design system, for example, is something relatively new that we have at WhatsApp, that we are starting to make very tiny visual alignment shifts to the palette, to the color, integrating in a grid that for most people won't be noticeable, but should start to clean up some of the elements of the design. And so that's how it's a very carefully released stages of change. And I don't think that even if we looked at some of this vision stuff, we would be rolling big things out. What works for WhatsApp now is carefulness in terms of how we release things. And I think it's been interesting because we think about new services now, whereas that's just not been something that WhatsApp has had to think about. It's always been improving the curvature of a speech bubble, or looking at color alignment and trying to refine the design over time. But I think now we're looking at new surfaces and how do we introduce those, or do we not introduce those? Are they discovered organically because that makes sense and it's natural? So I think there's a lot of trying to think about how do we build out and evolve WhatsApp, but still keep it true to what it's meant to be, which is around messaging. There's a lot of thinking involved in right now, and how we do that and what that looks like.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I mean, I assume, when people think about WhatsApp, I think people think about an experience that, as you said, is being designed very carefully. If you look at how maybe, the Facebook interface has changed over the years quite dramatically, I think. If you look at the desktop version, for example, and on some other services, they changed more rapidly. By WhatsApp, and I think that's what people appreciate also. It's not changing that rapidly, with any new trend or, potential idea. So I think that is very interesting that you also shine some light. There is a lot of work in the background. It's actually a very complex product if you think about integration to services. I mean, I was recently using WhatsApp for Business. I didn't know that existed, and there's a whole another world basically behind it. Even though people, I think, I really know this one interface basically, the chat. I think the complexity of the product is often, I think, not even noticeable to the user, which I think is interesting that you shed some light on. Talking about maybe a bit about design cultures and design leadership, you have been managing a lot of different design projects, different teams, throughout your career, and working with, really excellent product teams. What were some principal learnings you learned that make a great product team really one of the world's best?
I think part of it is just having sheer passion for what it is that you do, like that, knowing that design is core to what someone's interest and passion is. I think that's kind of where it starts with the heart in a way. I think it's a very emotional connection to design, and that kind of drive, I think, gives people just the energy to do something good. And then I think the flip side of that is, to ensure doing good work means you have to have a happy team. And how do you maintain those things? And I think it's trying to clear as many obstacles out of the way that don't feel like design. I'm a big fan of design hops. I think they're invaluable. I know I'm not the most organized person, and DPMs and design operations has been kind of like a godsend to me. They're like the part of the brain that I don't have. But I think for a lot of people in design, it's looking at how do we unblock design from the things that they get confronted by, that we can kind of free them up to then focus on the craft. I think craft and being good at what you do from a craft perspective makes you proud of what it is that you're producing and you're doing. I think another thing that's really important is having some kind of North Star, whether that moves or changes or shifts on someone. I think that's completely fine. But I think when you don't know where you're headed and you don't know why, it's really hard for people to be driven towards something. Yeah, you want to make things look nice, but you want to know why. And you want to know to what end. And so I think it's really important to have that. I think transparency is another thing that's really important, to gain trust and to have a connection with your team. And I think being able to innovate and, push things a little bit further out keeps you kind of like your mind going a little bit, in terms of entrepreneurship and thinking about where things can go. And ownership, I think allowing people the trust and transparency, and then being held accountable for some of the work that they do also gives people a certain level of autonomy and pride in what they do. So I think from a design leadership standpoint, those are the types of things that produce good work, because generally you're going to have a happier team. It's been interesting to even know if the team's happy when you're remote. I think that's like another dimension that I'm not really sure how to I don't have the answer to. I don't know. It's a tricky one. It's interesting, but I there must be some mechanisms that we can start to look at. I don't think anyone has solved it perfectly though, because everyone I talk to seems to still have the same kind of challenges with the remote aspect. But those are the things that I think help teams thrive from a design leadership standpoint, produce good work.
Yeah, I mean, that totally makes sense. And you really emphasize these emotional factors, right, that are important for a great, innovative team, which I think totally makes sense. And I also agree to your point regarding, like how do you actually, in times like COVID, to actually foster collaboration the best way? I think that we still have to learn what are the best ways to, I think, put teams together, have them really strive. And, obviously this is different to if you have a more physical setup. I assume also in the different companies that you worked on, that design was integrated quite differently. Maybe you had a central design team there, and maybe you have another team, another company where, design is within the products. And maybe in addition, you had maybe a central design team, which looked at the horizontal, basically, alignment. How did it work at the different companies, and what did you learn when it comes to integrating design in product teams or not?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because that is something I'm pretty passionate about too. I think in most places, at Net-a-Porter and Mr. Porter, the team was relatively small, and we just kind of worked across things, although we were somewhat embedded and kind of organized by cross journey to some extent. And the teams were more or less embedded a little bit, but we would always share across. It was a little bit more of a free-flowing construct. At Airbnb, when I first got there, we were embedded. As we kind of ebbed and flowed over time, we started to think about moving toward a studio model of sorts, not as an agency, but largely because embedded, we had on the hosting side in particular, Guest was different. Guest was a smaller team, and it was easier to work as surface teams. So there might be search as a team, and the PDP, which is the product detail page, might be a team. Whereas on the hosting side, you had like 9 verticals that focus one on hotels, another one could focus on RVO, which is kind of like a rent by owner, like the bread and butter start of hosting. There might be a team that focuses purely on quality of a stay, but all these teams might use varying similar interfaces, but not the same interface. It gets really messy. Multiple roadmaps that are duplicative, kind of, but then like it just gets messy. So we started to look at a model where you have possibly a really tiny team embedded for experimentation, but very little experimentation. Because like, I think you had mentioned this before, but a lot of times experiments just lead to little tiny incremental change, whereas we weren't being as transformative as we could be. So looking at something that was more of a cohesive journey team that started to look at things cross journey meant we could have a better design system, more cohesion, less duplication of roadmaps, but it also meant a little bit more overhead in terms of either DPMs or project management and intake requests of how do we work with embedded teams. And there was a really close partnership with the tech teams as well, because the tech team also had similar problems. They had like a spaghetti tech stack they were working with. We had kind of a spaghetti front end. Both of our teams could take advantage of a more centralized approach to design. So in that sense, that was the direction that made sense. It was more of a hybrid approach. My feeling is that like Spotify too, I've been talking to people who were there and had some people who worked from Spotify who went to Airbnb. And it just seems like the natural ebb and flow of growth is that you go between in this pendulum effect between embedded to hybrid to centralized based on where you're at in terms of growth. And I think that was my experience. That's been my experience so far. WhatsApp, we're in a pillar structure, which is more or less embedded, but we have a design system team in London as well, where that one is horizontal, and it's one of the only horizontal teams looking across everything. And so I think we'll see how that goes. I think we're still quite small in terms of the design team. We'll see if we need to change that in any way. I'd love to try to keep the embedded nature a little flex in case we need to support in certain ways as we grow. But that's kind of the organizational constructs. I think if you don't have a team that's looking at things horizontally, you really start to run the risk of just really making a broken experience or duplication of roadmaps. You even have that even if you are centralized to some extent. But I think when you have that, it can help just make sure that there is more cohesion that happens as you scale. I'm curious to know if there's any other models, but I think the hybrid approach is probably, when you get to a certain size, might be the best approach. And some of that was kind of inspired about how Apple was structured on the HIG teams and looking at how they do things too. That sort of thing always fascinates me in terms of how do you pivot growth and change team constructs as you grow a team and make sure that you're still maintaining high quality output.
Yeah, I mean, that makes total sense. You're touching on a couple of important topics. I mean, yeah, you like if you not have a horizontal design team, you run into problems. I think there's also a culture aspect, right? Where if you don't connect the designers in the different teams, you also lack, or you don't have any design community, right?
Yeah.
I think sometimes like designers are also looking for the home, like where are the other designers in the company, and how could we collaborate and how can we sync certain topics. I think by definition, I think designers are always looking for that alignment and that synchronization of the experience. So I think it's not just important rationally because you don't want to have a broken experience, but like it's also important emotionally. To have designers connected and basically have other designers to collaborate. It's interesting that you mentioned that it always changes. I think that's also interesting. Like that it depends totally on the stage you are in a company.
Yeah, completely.
But you probably having a hybrid approach makes sense because neither of the vertical or horizontal kind of work in any scenario. Obviously, this is very depending on the scenario, right? That might be very different maybe to other companies that maybe have design teams at smaller or the product teams at smaller size. Kat, I would really like to thank you for your insights and your perspectives. Unfortunately, we need to wrap it up because of time now, but thank you so much for the time.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. It was nice talking to you.
All right, that was the episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give it a thumbs up and let me know in the comments or by taking me in a post. What were the biggest learnings for you in the episode? I'm always super curious about that. If the episode provided you a lot of value, Make sure to follow and subscribe and share it with friends or others so they also have the chance to learn and grow themselves. All right, until next time, cheers.